Now we move from the story-type format of Job to the prosaic part. The book of Job is what we call a didactic poem, and here we begin to see the prose-type format of the book come to light. David Pawson explains the difference between prose and poetry in Scripture, and why poetic language is used to tell a story such as this story of Job. Quote, "It is relatively easy to spot poetry in modern Bibles, since the print is arranged differently from prose sections. Prose is the more natural and spontaneous way to communicate. People speak and write in prose, using a variety of sentence lengths to communicate their point. Poetry is an abnormal and artificial way of writing. It needs to be prepared beforehand. It requires considerable thought, and the words used need to obey the rules of the poetic style. Poetry has a much deeper effect on people than prose. Poetry can penetrate parts of the personality that prose would leave untouched." Unquote. So, in the rest of the book of Job, we find less description and a predominance of dialogue between Job, his three friends, and later on, even God himself. These conversations between the five personalities give us great insight as to why righteous, God-fearing people suffer, and also into the sovereignty of the Almighty.
After this, Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. And Job spoke and said, "May the day perish on which I was born, and the night in which it was said, a male child is conceived. May that day be darkness. May God above not seek it, nor the light shine upon it. May darkness and the shadow of death claim it. May a cloud settle on it. May the blackness of the day terrify it. As for that night, may darkness seize it. May it not rejoice among the days of the year. May it not come into the number of the months. O may that night be barren. May no joyful shout come into it. May those curse it who curse the day, those who are ready to arouse Leviathan. May the stars of its morning be dark. May it look for light, but have none, and not see the dawning of the day, because it did not shut up the doors of my mother's womb, nor hide sorrow from my eyes."
It isn't hard to see why Job cried for his own non-existence. Most, if not all of us who have been through less, have wished that we'd never been born at one point or another in our lives. It's not exactly that we want to die, but we question the reason for existing in the first place. All of us experience the inevitable problems of this world. Jesus said, "In this world you will have trouble." John 16, verse 33. And we do. Trouble is a part of this world because it is a fallen world. The planet we live on and everyone in it are cursed from the fall. After Adam and Eve sinned, God said, "Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil you will eat food from it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your brow you will eat your food until you return to the ground." Genesis 3, verse 17b, bud, and 19a. I believe that the reference to thorns and thistles in verse 18 refers to the trials and problems sin would bring upon man in this world. The book of Job teaches us that all will suffer due to the fall, regardless of anything we do. It's worth mentioning that only Jesus Christ is able to reverse this curse upon the earth. His miracles on earth were a foretaste of the consummation he will manifest at his second coming. Although there is much repetition in the point made by Job, I'd like to, nonetheless, take each line at a time and comment on it for the sake of understanding every little detail of what's being said. Repetition in the Bible indicates emphasis, and so even if Job says the same thing 10 times in 10 different ways, I think that each line was put here for a reason, and that we should give each one equal attention. Satan said that Job would curse God for his troubles, but instead, Job curses the day of his birth. He is in so much anguish of body and soul that he wishes the day that he had been born had never even existed. In verse 4, Job wishes that the day would be darkness, and that God would not seek it, or remember it. Further on in verse 5, Job even wishes for the shadow of death to claim the day of his birth and terrify it to the point of non-existence. This poetic language is meant to bring the reader into an empathetic understanding of how bad his sufferings actually are. It gives us insight into how he is feeling, because all of us have felt the same way to some degree or another. Again in verse 6, Job wishes the night of his birth to be seized by darkness, and that the record of that day be stricken from the number of days in the month and year. There is more repetition of this in verse 7, and Job adds his longing that no joyful shout came out from that night. It was predominant in Eastern culture, and still is today, to celebrate the birth of a son. A son was a sign that God had blessed the family, as it ensured the continuation of the family line. Job is saying here that that day was not a blessed one, but wishes instead that it was shrouded in darkness and would go out of existence. Verse 8 can be tricky to interpret. Let me try and paraphrase it to make it a bit more understandable. The men who stir up the monster of the sea, may they also curse the day of my birth. The word Leviathan is actually interpreted from the literal Hebrew word dragon, making it difficult to know exactly what Job is referring to here. The King James interprets the word a dragon to mourning, meaning for the text to indicate that mourning women at a funeral would curse the day of his birth as they do the day of someone's death. Again, this is strong language, pointing out to us the intensity of Job's sufferings. Verse 9 is simple to understand. More of the same desire Job has for the day of his birth to have never come to light. In verse 10, the point culminates as Job announces the reason for the cursing of his birthday, because his mother gave birth to him, and he wishes that she never had. The passage that follows, which we will look at next, elaborates on this point made in verse 10. Job moves from wishing the day of his birth cursed to wishing that he had died at birth. Let's read the text to get an overview.
Why did I not die at birth? Why did I not perish when I came from the womb? Why did the knees receive me, or why the breasts that I should nurse? For now I would have lain still and been quiet, I would have been asleep. Then I would have been at rest with kings and counselors of the earth, who built ruins for themselves, or with princes who had gold, who filled their houses with silver. Or why was I not hidden like a stillborn child, like infants who never saw light? There the wicked cease from troubling, and there the weary are at rest. There the prisoners rest together. They do not hear the voice of the oppressor. The small and great are there, and the servant is free from his master.
Verses 11 and 12, verse 12 being a poetic repetition of verse 11, are very strong statements, aren't they? Why did I not die at birth? Why did I not perish when I came from the womb? Why did the knees receive me? Or why the breasts that I should nurse? I know I've said that to myself a few times in my life, and that with much less valid reason than what Job had. This really is only the type of thing we say when we are in deep anguish. But this is more than just a question to show his desire for dying because of his suffering. Job is actually asking a philosophical question. What's the meaning of life? If our lives really had any meaning, wouldn't they be worth something more than all this strife? This is a valid question, one that all fallen people will probably ask themselves at some point or another. But as we will learn further on in the book of Job, and as we learn throughout the rest of the Bible, it's really not about us at all, is it? It's all about God and how we can glorify Him through our lives. Sometimes that means suffering. Like we saw before in chapter 1 and 2, it's how we respond to our suffering that counts to God's glory if done righteously. Suffering is an opportunity to glorify God. James tells us to be joyful in our suffering. James 1 verse 2. And if we look at the Acts of the Apostles, we see them rejoicing because they were counted worthy to suffer for Christ's name's sake. Acts 5 verse 41. How different we would look at things if we saw life this way. Suffering is a blessing. Wow. I really like verse 13. For now I would have lain still and been quiet. I would have been asleep, then I would have been at rest. It's one of those few verses that confirm what we all know in our hearts. There are so many debates about what happens to children when they die, but this verse really clenches the resolution for me. Job is saying that if he died during childbirth, he would be at rest. Let's take the message we get from this verse, although out of the context it is being laid down as here, and look at some other verses in the Bible that render this same truth to us. To elaborate on this, remember the story of David and Bathsheba? David had committed adultery with her and even murdered her husband in a very devious way. God declared through his prophet Nathan that David and Bathsheba's child, who was conceived in their sin, would die. Sure enough, after the child was born, God struck him with illness. But David sought God's mercy and fasted and prayed for 7 days, pleading with God to save his son. It was not to be. The child died, and afterward David stopped fasting. His servants could not understand their king's logic. Why fast while the child is alive? And when it dies, stop fasting? Then David makes a bold statement to his servants in response to their scrutiny. And he said, "While the child was alive, I fasted and wept, for I said, 'Who can tell whether the Lord will be gracious to me that the child may live?' But now he is dead. Why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I shall go to him, but he shall not return to me." 2 Samuel 12, verse 22 to 23. David acknowledged that he would meet his child again, and there is no doubt to the reader of Scripture as to where David went when he died and where he is right now. Another verse to illustrate this point is in Deuteronomy. "Moreover, your little ones and your children, who you say will be victims, who today have no knowledge of good and evil, they shall go in there. To them I will give it, and they shall possess the land." Deuteronomy 1 verse 39. We also see how the Lord has such a wonderful, special place in his heart for children in Luke 18 verse 16, Ezekiel 16 verse 20 to 22, and Jeremiah 49 verse 11, among others. What a wonderful comfort to all those who have lost a young child to know that God keeps them safe in his arms. Let's get back to Job now. We have seen that Job wishes for peace and that he would have had that peace if he had died at birth. In verse 14 and 15, he announces that had he died at birth, though only a child, he would have been equal with kings and princes, enjoying the same honor they do within their eternal dwellings. Job is here imagining what his soul could have experienced in death, and that being so much more enjoyable and peaceful than his current situation. He does not count any of the joy he knew throughout his life as having any value, but his suffering as being so bad that it outweighs all the good, and he wishes he were dead from the start of his life. Oh, how dreadfully Job must have suffered for him to have said these things. In verses 16 to 19, we have a repetition of what we have already looked at. In verse 16, he imagines himself happier to be a stillborn child who has never seen the light of day. In verse 17, he again confirms the rest and peace that these souls experience when they die. Verse 18 sees Job describing that place as a paradise where no one is troubled by the voice of Satan, who is called the oppressor. Again, verse 19 affirms the equality that exists in this paradise. There is no status order there. Though all are, quote, prisoners, unquote, at rest, no rank exists among the temporary residents of paradise.
Why is light given to him who is in misery, and life to the bitter of soul who long for death, but it does not come, and search for it more than hidden treasures, who rejoice exceedingly, and are glad when they can find the grave? Why is light given to a man whose way is hidden, and whom God has hedged in? For my sighing comes before I eat, and my groaning pours out like water. For the thing I greatly feared has come upon me, and what I dreaded has come upon me. I am not at ease, nor am I quiet. I have no rest, for trouble comes.
Job is once again questioning the meaning of life in verse 20. It's as if he is saying, what's the point of all this? If I have to suffer and can't enjoy life, then why keep me alive at all? Sounds a bit self-centered, doesn't it? But our friend Job puts it so elegantly that all we notice is his deep suffering. As we come to the end of chapter 3, we really get the idea that the whole chapter is all about understanding as much as we can about how severe Job's pain is. Why am I alive? Why, we hear him object. The loss of his children, the destruction of all he owns, and a body in complete and utter agony have Job begging for an answer to life's deepest questions. What's the point of it all? In verses 21 and 22, Job sounds completely suicidal, as he speaks of longing for death and searching for it like hidden treasures. But the fact is that if Job wanted to kill himself, he could have done so. Something must have kept him going. John MacArthur notes the following, quote, "There is no hint that Job wanted to take his own life, for there was nothing stopping him. Job still trusted God for his sovereign hand in the matter of death, but he did consider the many ways in which death would be a perceived improvement to the present situation because of the pain." Unquote. Verses 23 to 25 read, "Why is light given to a man whose way is hidden, and whom God has hedged in?" The hedge spoken of here is not one of protection and providence, but a hedge of strife and affliction. Job is asking why God would keep someone alive just to make them suffer when death is such a welcomed prospect. Further in the next verse, he explains that there is no joy left for him. He has lost his appetite, and all that remains for him is mourning and grief. The final 2 verses end Job's discourse with something we all hope never to say, that his worst fears have become a reality. Yet Job still finds himself in a state of constant anxiety that further suffering will occur. Is there any end to this pain? Don't lose hope yet. Remember, Job's comforters are with him. Surely they will have something enlightening to say? Let's find out in the next video when we delve into chapter 4 of this book. Till then, God bless.